In 694 BC, the mighty Assyrian king Sennacherib sat in Nineveh, planning to neutralize the unruly land of Babylonia and its allies. Almost a decade earlier, he had first involved himself with these southern territories, with mixed results. The city of Babylon lay firmly under the control of Sennacherib's son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, but the rest of the territories were in constant unrest, and the neighboring kingdom of Elam posed a significant security threat. Striking first there, Sennacherib hoped to extinguish the Babylonian and Elamite collaboration threat. The soldiery worked with skilled sailors to build strong boats which they could transport down the Euphrates to the mouth of the Gulf. The treacherous marshes posed a significant difficulty, but the king and his forces inevitably made it to the shore, from where they could launch their invasion into the land of Elam. The 694 campaign went favorably for Sennacherib as the Elamites were crushed, and in the words of the royal scribe, the Assyrians poured out deathly silence over the wide land of Elam. But all would not stay well for long. The Elamite king Halule led a counter-strike as the Assyrian army was still emerging from the swamps near the Gulf, and continued in a wave of destruction through Babylonia proper. In the midst of the chaos, Sennacherib's son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, was handed over by his own people to the Elamite invaders. As Halule and his army returned home with conquest fresh in their minds, and the splendid prize, Ashur-nadin-shumi, in their hands, they must have felt elated. In a foreign land, far from the protective hand of Ashur, Sennacherib's son was murdered by his captors, like a dog. The king would not let the Elamites have the last word, however. Some vicious back-and-forth fighting demonstrated Assyria the superior, and a temporary peace was established. A few years later, the ostensibly loyal leader of Babylon, Shuzubu, was caught collaborating with the Elamites. The petty ruler sent enticing bribes from the treasuries of Babylon's temples, and promised that the combined might of his allies could stand up to the Assyrian overlords. The whole ordeal was surely exhausting for Sennacherib, as the constant warring in the south expended vast amount of resources and distracted him from proper management of the rest of his empire. The endless persistence of his enemies needed to be squashed, so he set out on a campaign to the south one last time. The greatest force the Babylonians had yet assembled sat ready for the arrival of their enemy. Elamites, Aramaeans, Iranians, and Chaldeans all committed themselves to throw off the burden of the imperial yoke. For Sennacherib, the importance of this battle was hard to overstate. The combined might of his rebellious adversaries had assembled against him and determined to contest the rightful rule of Ashur's hand. In the famous Chicago Prism, Sennacherib's scribes recounted the ensuing battle of Halule with great literary ability and a multitude of allusions to early tales that create a rich intertextuality. For such a magnificent account, this battle must have been equally grand in scope and consequence. The most important texts for the Assyrian retelling of the battle were the Enuma Elish, Sargon's narrative of his 8th campaign, the Tukulti-Ninurta epic, and the Era epic. All were important compositions in their own right, and through their incorporation into the account of the Battle of Halule, Sennacherib intended to make a clear argument about his own position in history, as a conquering storm, a tamer of chaos, and most importantly, a capable king. I will cover the connections with the Enuma Elish as an example. If you are not already aware of the Enuma Elish, it will suffice to say that it was the Babylonian creation myth. The chief Babylonian god Marduk battles against the goddess Tiamat and the forces of chaos, and creates the world out of her remains. By making strong connections with this myth in his account of the Battle of Halule, Sennacherib is associating himself with Marduk and thus framing the battle on a cosmic scale. Similar vocabulary is used to describe the enemies of Marduk and Sennacherib, namely Gale Lemnuti, or wicked demons in English. Sennacherib uses the same mulmulu arrows that Marduk employs, and he is depicted driving over the bodies of his enemies in a chariot similarly to Marduk. The textual argument implicit with this similar vocabulary and imagery is that Sennacherib is the mighty warrior who defeats chaos and forges order out of the carnage of his enemies, just like the god Marduk defeated Tiamat and created the world out of her remains. And over all this hangs the intense irony that Marduk is a Babylonian god, not an Assyrian one. The exceptional confidence that Sennacherib's account exudes, the result of the conflict is still debated. To me, it seems likely it was an Assyrian victory, because of the lengths Sennacherib went to promote his success. If it was truly a defeat, he could have more easily covered it up with ambiguous language or omission altogether. Judging by the Assyrian accounts, this was one of the most magnificent and important battles the king fought in. But it was not the end. The city of Babylon had yet to be subjugated, and the threat of the Elamites was not yet exterminated. This task was no laughing matter, but its completion proved relatively manageable compared to the previous years of great horror and violence. Babylon was sacked and utterly destroyed. The streets were purposefully flooded with the waters of the river, and the foundations of its buildings leveled. The people of the city were responsible for the death of thousands of Assyrians, years of draining war, and the death of Sennacherib's son. The king would not see any options aside from the complete and utter destruction of the city. The land was now subjugated, and the chaotic forces of the enemy were defeated. A stillness hung in the air over the meadow of Assyrian domination. The Babylonians would finally be quiet.